Thank you, everyone, for having me. Pleasure to be back here at the Agile Turkey Summit. We'll talk about what one can learn from self-organization without necessarily always being self-organized. There's a certain reality where probably not all of us will be able to live in a completely self-organized kind of company. So this is what I'll be talking about. The company I founded and I'm working at still is a company called Life Sciences. We, basically do consultancy work in that sense. We've been inspired by a book called Reinventing Organizations. Some of you probably have read that or have heard about it. It's by a guy called Frederick Laloux, and he basically described how progressive organizations work and did a bit of research and really just shared his examples on that. So we are operating in that way since we started 6.5 years ago, which means, totally flat structure. There is a completely self-organized teams. It's a role-based way of working. Everyone defines their salary themselves, completely free range, the really extreme, crazy things. But it's all based on some principles, and these principles are actually relatively similar to the Agile world. It's all based on self-management, on autonomy, and on trusting people actually to do their job. So this is what I'll be talking about and share a few practices. In the briefings and in the preparation for that, we said, well, let's make it a bit more practical because you've all heard the theory about all of these concepts, I'm sure. So I'll keep that short and then we look into what makes sense, and also keep the questions coming on YouTube or wherever, and then we can have a look at these as well. So who you see there is part of the team. There's also a company cow that we have. So we're a Swiss-based company, so we love the Alps and the mountains generally. And having a cow is probably one of the things you will remember. If you don't remember anything else, people usually remember that we have a company cow. So here you go. Other than that, for everyone who has no idea about teal or has never heard about teal, maybe it's basically describing these paradigm shifts that we all talk about. So on the left, you see, typically we move from hierarchical structures to more flexible teams, to agile teams, for example. We talk about how to break silos, have a different way of collaborating, and all these kind of things. And obviously that also means, that also means that there is certain other ways of organizing. There's a different way of decision making needed. Probably there's a different way of managing change needed, which is a more continuous way of looking at change and all these kind of things. And what you see on the right-hand side is basically what Frederick Laloux in his book talked about, which is called teal. You can also use holacracy. Some of you probably know holacracy or sociocracy maybe as well. And basically there's three central elements or three pillars, three core principles of what Frederick described in his book. And these are self-management. So progressive organizations are much, much closer to self-management or are actually self-managing. Evolutionary purpose. So companies are more purpose-driven. They don't only drive the organization by profit, by bottom line results. There's also something around, well, we want to have an impact. There's some meaning in our work. So and that's something that gets more important over the past years anyway as well. And then there's this pillar that is called wholeness, which basically means we do look at the world in a more humanistic kind of way. So we are all human beings. There's things that bother us at home. There's things that bother us in our private lives. There's no way that you can be as productive in your business setup as you would be when there's certain things not happening around you. And that's just acknowledging that we're all human beings. We are not perfect. We all have our little baggage basically, and this is how we look at it. So it's a bit more human type of interaction probably, and it's definitely based on self-management. And for the self-management, we've been inspired, also at the time when we started the company, we looked into different ways of doing that, and holacracy seemed quite helpful in a way of that there's circles and roles and all these kind of things. So kind of as an operating system, it made a lot of sense back then for us, although we adapted and customized and, do some things that are not necessarily by the book. So how are we organized? Well, there is a document that we call Lifeline. It's kind of our core central document where we have our principles, our values, our way of looking at the world and collaboration, especially. Just summarized, and it's only 10-15 pages, nothing huge. Kept it relatively short, but we touch on all sorts of different aspects. Like, just because we're self-organized doesn't mean we don't necessarily need plans and objectives. Chapter 3 that you see there. And the answer clearly is yes, we do need we do need plans and objectives, of course, because otherwise you're not having a direction. So typical agile idea, more structure, or the right way of structure, I'd rather say, leads to more autonomy. So this is the idea of this little booklet here as well. If you want, it's online, you can have a look at it. But basically the idea behind this, just summarize a few things that are important for us in our culture, in collaborating and working together in this little space. And if you want to look a bit more at the organizational structure, we obviously don't have a management and control type of idea with a pyramid and a hierarchy, although sometimes I must admit, there is certain advantages of having somebody calling the shots. And I sometimes, as one of the founders, think, you know what, if people just did what I said, then, it might be quicker. But anyway, it's a trusted environment, it's an autonomous environment, it's self-organizing teams. What you see there is the bubbles and the little circles as roles and responsibilities, basically. I'm sure you've seen that from all sorts of different ideas, holacracy, sociocracy, whatnot. Benefits are clear. I mean, we got a more entrepreneurial team. They understand the bigger picture. There's a lot of transparency for numbers, for everything really, and also how we're doing. So there's much more room for innovation, for ideas, for bringing themselves in, and there's a ton of commitment, which is amazing. With that setup, obviously, it's kind of autonomous by design. The structure's evolving. There's a bit more collaborative and agile approach to many things, of course. So this is what everyone wants. Now, the thing is, the reality is there's also challenges. There's a challenge in creating alignment with so much autonomy. The team's been growing quite a lot the last 2 or 3 years. We're more than 20 people now. And, it's just not easy with a team of 20 or 30 to be aligned and to go in the same direction, because everyone got their great ideas. And at the same time, we can't do everything. So that's part of the struggle. So usual challenge in many of these agile self-organized organizations, I think. There's still that thing that I'm one of the founders, I'm one of the owners, obviously, as well, of the company. So how is that looking like in the power game? We're self-organized, but there's an owner, there's a founder. Can I do more than the others? How does that look like? Also, leadership is an interesting one, of course. So if you have a decentralized or an autonomous organization, well, where's the leadership coming from? How do we make sure that people get the guidance that they need? How to make sure we stay aligned? So all of these questions are there. And obviously, with processes like self-set salaries, it just requires a huge maturity of everyone in the team. There's a lot of self-consciousness, self-awareness that's needed to set your salary by yourself and not being bothered by, what people around you are doing necessarily, or what kind of feedback you're getting. So it's not an easy one. And obviously, there's also no line manager or no boss where you can say, well, I have a conflict with my colleague. I have a tension. I think that's going wrong. So really the only way to address these tensions, these conflicts, or also just the potentials you see in the organization is by yourself. And also that is not an easy one necessarily. So what we are trying is, for all of these things that are not necessarily straightforward, to bring a bit of structure. So, typical agile idea. If you bring a certain structure, a certain guidance, then it will be easier for people to take the autonomy. So the structure is designed in a way that we can say, well, we give you structure in the sense that you know what to do, but the how and the content of it is totally up to you. So that's where the autonomy comes in. So that's the whole idea of our practices, basically. And looking at time as well, there's like 10 minutes, and then we go into Q&A, probably maybe 15 max, where I'd say, well, let's share some day-to-day examples so you see how it looks like. It's not so abstract. One thing is our decision-making modes and processes. So people understood relatively early, well, it's autonomous. I can decide whatever I want, more or less. Right? But then again, there's this huge space that I could take up. So how do I know which things to really work on? How do I know, I can decide that by myself? How do I know, it shouldn't involve maybe 10 other people? Because there's also a tendency with a small team of 5, 6 people that we had, it was easy. We just involved everyone. Now with the growing team, it doesn't make sense to involve 20 or maybe 30 people into decision making, right? So there needs to be another mechanism basically for people to feel safe and to feel confident to take certain decisions. So what we came up with is a really, really easy picture that you see on the left, which basically says, if it's a normal day-to-day decision, there's a no approval zone. Just do it. You are the activity owner. You're the role holder. You're the single decision maker. Just do it. Maybe if it gets a bit more tricky, a bit more hairy, well, there's maybe something that we call advice-seeking zone, right? I don't know what I don't know. We all have blind spots. It's normal. So it makes sense maybe for a bit bigger impact decisions to just check with a few colleagues what they think about it. Maybe you're taking a decision that's impacting them anyway. So this is what we call the advice seeking zone. And both combined take up probably like, 80% of the decisions. That keeps us flexible. That keeps the agility, that keeps the speed. If there was too little decisions taken without approval or without advice seeking, then it means we're likely getting slow and bureaucratic. So we try to avoid that. And then there's two other zones that are interesting. One is consent and one is consensus. So consensus, basically everyone agrees, it's for the big things. If we change our lifeline, if we talk about our purpose, for example, our purpose statement, that's something that we want everyone to agree. And it's important to spend the time. It is slow. It takes time, of course, but it makes sense to have everyone around it. Consent, on the opposite, is obviously only asking for objections. It's not asking for if I like the idea necessarily. So it's good enough for now, safe enough to try. Typical kind of approach. And we do that for big decisions that do have a big impact. And at the same time, we think, to keep us going, we can't always go for consensus. It doesn't make sense. And I personally think that consent decision making is probably, the magic bullet of decision making. Right? On the right-hand side, you also see a few examples, but what I really wanted to show you is a bit more theory on the consent decision-making, because again, I think it's amazing if you can implement that. And, just to make sure again, consensus means everyone agrees. So everyone has an opinion. I have an opinion on everything. So for the people who know me, right, I have an opinion on everything, of course. So that means you can end up in endless discussions with me, and obviously with most of the team, that's true as well. So if we look for consensus, it takes a while. It's relatively slow. Obviously, we have a lot of collaboration, we have a lot of exchange, we learn a lot. It's all nice. What it comes down to at the end, though, is that usually you have a compromise that is a diluted decision of what you actually wanted to do. So what happens quite a lot of times with consensus, and you see that in politics, for example, as well, as everyone's unhappy at the end of the day, right? So we're all unhappy with the decision, is somehow reflecting our wish, but somehow not, and it's not great. And again, it's slow, and the bigger the group is, the more inefficient it gets, of course. Now, consent on the other side, again, is asking for objections. An objection is a significant risk I see for the business, for our customers, for, if somebody's dying, it's not a good idea. So that's a proper objection. So the big difference in the conversation is I have a proposal. I'll ask for objections because, again, everyone has blind spots. Everyone has biases. I don't know what I don't know. So it will make sense to involve the team and say, hey, guys, is there any objections? This is my proposal. Do you think it's stupid in some place, basically? And is it missing something significant that there's a huge risk to the company, for example? So this gives everyone the chance to be heard. Right? Everyone can raise their objections. Everyone can raise their concerns about it. At the same time, we make sure that for the higher impact ones, it's actually not going into a stupid direction because of my blind spots. And it's relatively fast, right? Because I'm not asking for opinions and we discuss forever. I just ask for objections, and we don't actually discuss a lot around objections. So it's really fast, it's much more efficient, and I think is also much more effective, actually, especially if you think about innovation and innovative ideas. There's really interesting studies suggesting the more experts you involve in innovation or innovation decision processes, the less innovation you get. So actually, paradox, right? In the first place, you would think, well, if I involve more experts, then I get more innovation. It's completely wrong. And the reason is that you will never be able to rally a big group around a really innovative idea. Right? So that's the whole theory behind. So consent, on the contrary, is not asking me if I think it's a good idea. So there's more innovation coming from consent decision making, actually. And if you're interested how that looks like as a defined process, you can Google that. There's this Sociocratic idea. There's the S3 framework and toolbox. You can use that one, for example. It's relatively simple. You start by a proposal. Everyone can ask clarifying questions. You can even do that offline. So we do it offline quite a lot of times for governance change proposals and these kind of things. Somebody sharing on Slack what kind of proposal they have. You can ask clarifying questions up front. Sometimes we even skip the reactions round. Reactions is basically an opinion round, similarly to consensus. You ask for my opinion. The big difference is that we don't go into discussions. Right? You just listen to me once. I have the chance to raise my voice. Is okay. I'm heard, but then we cut it. There's no discussions. And then we go into the important things, which is obviously objections. And then it's done. If there's no objections left, then we just go ahead and it's implemented. The decision is taken. It's a really good way to speed up decision making, just to give you one example. And we use that for almost all bigger decisions that we have in the company. Really good. Another one that's key is obviously feedback. There's also mastering conflicts. As I said before, raising your tensions and conflict is incredibly difficult because you can't defer back to your line manager. You have to take care of it yourself because you simply don't have a line manager. So how do I manage, my conflicts, the little things with my colleagues? Because on the one hand side, I like them most of the time. We're working together. I don't want to mess up our working climate, of course. So how do we make sure that we still address conflicts and not ending up in this superficial harmony where we just don't address it and we pretend that we are happy and we're actually not? And one thing that we use is this framework, nonviolent communication, not developed by us. Many of you have seen that before, I'm sure, where you basically phrase your conflict, your tensions, your ideas as well. Tensions can also be a potential, something that could be improved or something that we're not leveraging right now, with your observations, the feelings coming with it for you, the needs you have, and then the request for change. So that framework is really helpful. And what we are doing as well is we have a monthly tension meeting. So once a month, we all come together as a company for everything that's related to our company tensions. So there might be, somebody is not filling out the time booking sheet and they just need to do that, or somebody's not filling out the cash flow forecast, and they're not doing it. Typical tensions that we have against the big group in a way. Or there's more juicy ones, of course, where we think, do we have the right level of commitment? Do we adhere to our lifeline? There's all sorts of interesting things coming up. And we said, if we want conflict and tension to be normal and part of the day-to-day, well, then actually we should make it part of the day-to-day. And this is why we have a standing meeting created once a month, tension meeting, 1 hour, we all come together. We have a Google Sheet that we are using for that as well. So, you can just type in your tension up front. That usually clarifies half the tension already, of course. But, and then we talk about it. And this is an incredibly interesting space because what happens is that outside the meeting, obviously people talking as well, they address their tensions and all these kind of things. And it's really, really important to have conflict being part of your culture, because again, a constructive way of talking about what's not right will be the only way to bring your organization forward and will be the only way for a high-performing team. But this is why that's one of our key practices, actually. Now, the other one that's obviously important next to conflict is also just feedback. How do people see me in certain situations? And also that can be tricky, because sometimes people say, I observe Tim as not being professional enough in the way of communicating, or a bit less or a bit too little empathetic, and these kind of things. And what usually triggers that is obviously a defensive reaction on my end. So if you use, in that case, the Oscar framework that we are using from time to time, or rather some of us are using for feedback, is really helpful, because also there you basically describe an outcome or an expectation. But if we don't agree on the expectation, the rest of the discussion is kind of, I just need to understand we don't need to agree, because if we come from different places, what you expect from me in this role, for example, then is a bit tricky to agree on all the rest. And then you describe the situations, what kind of actions you saw, and the review part, the R, is really important as well. So what is it that we want to change? Because sometimes we just agree to disagree and there's actually no change. And that triggers more tensions, because you would see my behavior coming back, probably. Now, the thing is, if I don't agree, or we don't agree together that there's actual change needed, then in the R, we basically agree that there's nothing changing. It's really good, because people can let go then. Now, the other way around, maybe there's something that I want to change in my behavior. It's something I want to observe or something, right? And then it's really good to have a buddy to come back to that and hold me accountable, because we're all busy. There's all sorts of things going on. And it's good to have somebody saying, hey, by the way, Tim, we had that conversation like 4 weeks ago, and you said that you want to take this action. So here's our review meeting or review Slack message, and if it's easier. So it's a really nice framework as well that we're using for feedback, and it's actually really good. If you look at the team meetings, as I said before, there's all sorts of things that we're doing to make it efficient, to keep it autonomous as much as we can. One thing that is really important, I think, especially in this virtual way of working together, how do you have a creative discussion? How do you make sure that there's also everyone heard in the process? And some of you maybe have heard about liberating structures. Is a toolbox in a way, which is great, and has all sorts of methods. What you see on here is this 1, 2, 4 all method. So basically silent reflection, you come together in pairs and discuss your reflections. You're coming together in 2 pairs, so 4 people, and then everyone in the group. And what this method, for example, does is It helps more introvert people, less vocal people, maybe, or just people who like to think it through properly in the beginning before starting a discussion, to just be part of that. And it's not just three people dominating the room and the rest of the meeting sitting there. Yeah, so this is one way how we look into more creating a more inclusive environment. Diversity and inclusion, obviously a big topic for us. Out of the little 20 people that we have, we got, I think, at the moment 12 or 13 different nationalities, which is amazing. It's great, and we all come from all sorts of backgrounds. But how do we make sure there's not only diversity, there's actually inclusion as well? So this is one of the methods we're using quite a lot, and making sure that we hear everyone and actively shaping our meetings like that. And obviously check-ins, check-outs, and all these kind of things around wholeness, and making sure that it's not just a work meeting. It's also, well, how do I feel today? What does it look like? And I think what's important as well, don't just make it that same question, like how do you feel today? My answer will always be good, because that's a German engineer, kind of empathetic as a stone. My only emotion is good or bad. You probably hear I feel good or I feel bad. Now, if you make it a bit more fun, first of all, it's staying exciting, and it's not always the same. You can use animals. We use a lot of animal pictures for these check-ins, and you say, well, I feel like that sleepy cheetah there on the top left, and it's just what it is, and all of a sudden you have a different conversation. So that's the idea behind this. And I'll be sharing the slides. There's a self-set salary process, as I mentioned. We can dive into that if you wanted to. There's more around the weekly meetings if you're interested. But really what I wanted to say before I stop talking is, where do you start? Where can you start making a difference? And I think it's really this top left one here, this why not mentality. So instead of asking yourself, why should I do that? Ask yourself, why not? And that turns it around completely. So, if you want to get going, if you want to make a difference, I think, it's a good thing to just ask, why not? What's the risk? Is it safe enough to try? And most of the time it's safe enough to try. Doesn't mean it's always going to be great, of course, but is a good starting point. So that would be my suggestion, obviously. And with that, I want to thank you for listening. I think it's slightly over time, but we got enough time for questions if there's any. And I leave you with the Einstein quote, which is, the world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. So if you change your thinking, the world will be changing. And with that, back to you and seeing if there's any questions.